When we think of the Tudors, we think of spectacle and excess, of the monstrous ego of Henry VIII, the golden age of Elizabeth I, of grand palaces and public executions. But the story of this legendary dynasty does not begin in splendor. It begins in darkness, with a ghost sitting on the English throne. His name was Henry Tudor, and he would become King Henry VII. He won his crown through a single, desperate gamble. On August 22, 1485, on a wet field at Bosworth, his small, ragged army defeated the forces of King Richard III. Henry became king by right of conquest, but this right was a fragile one, for his claim to the throne by blood was laughably weak. He was a usurper, a Welsh outsider who had spent most of his life in exile. He knew that every powerful nobleman in the kingdom looked at him not with loyalty, but with calculation, wondering when the time would be right to depose him, just as he had deposed Richard. So from the very first day of his reign, Henry Tudor was a man haunted by paranoia. He saw assassins in every shadow and conspiracies in every whisper. His court was not a place of celebration, but a nest of suspicion. He trusted no one, for he knew the crown had been won by betrayal and could be lost in the same way. This sets up our central question. How does a man with no right to be king hold on to a kingdom that does not want him? Do you win their love? Do you earn their respect? Henry Tudor chose a different path. He decided that if he could not be loved, he would be feared. And if the nobility would not give him their loyalty, he would extract it through a reign of quiet, bureaucratic, and financial terror. This is the story of the Winter King, the dark founder of the Tudor Dynasty. The story of how a paranoid exile built England's most famous royal house not on a foundation of glory, but of fear. Henry's paranoia was not a product of his imagination. The ghosts of the old royal house, the Plantagenets, were very real, and they came for him almost immediately. His reign was a constant battle against phantom princes, resurrected from the dead to challenge his stolen crown. The first threat was almost farcical. In 1487, a rebellion rose up around a 10-year-old boy named Lambert Simnel. Coached by a priest, Simnel claimed to be the Earl of Warbeck, a true Plantagenet prince whom Henry actually held prisoner in the Tower of London. The plot was absurd. Henry even paraded the real Earl of Warbeck through the streets of London to prove Simnel was a fake. But the rebellion gained powerful support from nobles desperate to see Henry fall. Henry crushed the rebel army in a bloody battle. In a shrewd move of psychological warfare, he didn't execute the boy pretender. Instead, he pardoned him and gave him a job as a scullion in the royal kitchens at Daily. Humiliating reminder to all that this was the pathetic fate of those who challenged him. But the next ghost was far more dangerous. In 1491, a charismatic, well-spoken young man appeared in Ireland, claiming to be Richard, Duke of York the younger of the two famous princes in the Tower, supposedly murdered years earlier. This was Perkin Warbeck. For 7 long years, Warbeck was a dagger pointed at the heart of Henry's reign. He was a masterful actor, convincing some of Europe's most powerful rulers of his identity. The King of France welcomed him. The Holy Roman Emperor backed him. The King of Scotland gave him a royal cousin for a wife and launched an invasion of England on his behalf. Warbeck was everything Henry feared, a legitimate-looking claimant with powerful foreign allies. To fight these phantoms, Henry realized he could not rely on armies alone. He needed to fight fire with fire, shadows with shadows. This was the birth of the Tudor secret state. Henry began to build a vast and sophisticated network of spies and informants across England and Europe. Agents were paid to infiltrate rebel groups. Letters were intercepted. Plots were discovered before they could even begin. He even employed agents provocateurs, spies who would encourage treasonous talk among nobles, only to report them back to the king. But his most ingenious and terrifying weapon was financial. He and his ruthless administrators, men like Sir Reginald Bray, and the soon-to-be infamous duo of Edmund Dudley and Richard Empson, perfected a system of control called bonds and recognisances. It was brilliantly simple. A nobleman might be accused of some minor, often fabricated, offense. To avoid ruinous punishment, he would be forced to sign a bond, a massive IOU to the crown, payable on demand. This bond would hang over the nobleman's head like a sword, as long as he remained perfectly, unquestionably loyal. The debt would not be collected. But the moment he stepped out of line, whispered a treasonous word, or failed to inform on a neighbor, the king could demand payment and financially obliterate him and his entire family overnight. By the end of his reign, over 2/3 of England's nobility were trapped in this web of debt and fear. They were not loyal subjects, they were hostages. Henry had turned his entire aristocracy into a network of informants, all spying on each other to save themselves. He had crushed the pretenders, but in doing so, he had transformed his kingdom into a quiet, paranoid police state. Having neutralized the physical threats to his throne, Henry VII now turned to securing it for good. His method was not to build grand armies or magnificent palaces, but to wage a silent, merciless war on the one thing that truly underpinned the power of his rivals, their wealth. Henry's obsession with money was legendary, but it has often been misunderstood as simple greed. It was far more strategic than that. It was a weapon of absolute control. In Henry's cold, calculating mind, a bankrupt nobleman could not afford to be a rebellious nobleman. A lord buried in debt could not raise an army, and so he set out to systematically bleed his kingdom dry. This was not a king who delegated his finances. Henry was a micromanager of terrifying focus. Every night, he would personally inspect the royal account books, initialing every single page with his own hand. He tracked every penny that flowed into his coffers, his wealth becoming a barometer for his own security. To enact this financial terror, he unleashed two of the most hated men in English history, Edmund Dudley and Richard Empson. They were not great lords, but shrewd, ambitious lawyers, and they served their king with ruthless efficiency. Their task was to extract money from the nobility by any means necessary. They formed a branch of government called the Council learned in the law, which operated outside the normal legal system. It became a state-sanctioned extortion racket. Empson and Dudley dug up archaic, long-forgotten feudal laws and enforced them with brutal vigor. A nobleman who failed to have the correct license to hunt on his own land might face a fine equivalent to millions of dollars today, a clerical error in a property deed. from a grandfather's generation could lead to the confiscation of an entire estate. They perfected the art of the baseless accusation. A lord might be charged with treason, only for the charge to be dropped in exchange for a colossal bond that guaranteed his good behavior. The goal was not justice, it was the accumulation of leverage and cash. Great families who had commanded armies for centuries were financially crippled. Their fortunes siphoned directly into the king's private treasury. The psychological effect was devastating. The nobility lived in a state of constant, low-grade fear, aware that a single misstep, a single disgruntled servant's accusation could bring the fall, crushing weight of the king's financial machinery down upon them. Unlike the lavish, boisterous court his son would later create, Henry VII's court was a reflection of the man himself, quiet, austere, and suspicious. There were no grand feasts or extravagant tournaments. Every candle, every ounce of wine was accounted for. The king was hoarding his money, building a personal treasury that was the largest Europe had ever seen. For Henry, this mountain of gold was more than just wealth. It was his ultimate security blanket. It was a fortress of coin, built to protect the ghost on the throne from the enemies he saw lurking in every shadow. For years, Henry VII had meticulously built his fortress of fear and finance, and it seemed he had won. He had defeated the pretenders, neutralized the nobility, and filled his treasury. He had a healthy heir, Prince Arthur, married to a Spanish princess, Catherine of Aragon, securing a powerful foreign alliance. He had a beloved wife, Elizabeth of York, whose own royal blood had helped to heal the wounds of the Wars of the Roses. For the first time, the future of the Tudor Dynasty looked secure. And then, in an instant, it all shattered. The year 1502 was the beginning of the end for the Winter King. In April, his promising 16-year-old son, Arthur, the hope of the dynasty, died suddenly from a sweating sickness. The blow was devastating. All of Henry's careful planning, his entire life's work, had been undone. The succession was now thrown back onto his younger, largely untested son, the future Henry VIII. But fate was not finished with its cruelty. Less than a year later, seeking to secure the dynasty by bearing another son, Queen Elizabeth died in childbirth. This loss was more than just personal grief. It was a political catastrophe for Henry. Elizabeth had been the living symbol of unity between the houses of Lancaster and York. She was popular and beloved, and her presence had softened the edges of his grim reign. Her death untethered him. The one person he seemed to truly trust was gone. Now, he was utterly alone with his paranoia, and it consumed him. The final 7 years of Henry's reign were a descent into a cold, dark winter of tyranny. With Elizabeth gone, all restraint vanished. He unleashed his financial enforcers, Empson and Dudley, with a new ferocity. The extortion escalated, the fines became more ruinous, the atmosphere of dread more palpable. The nobility, who had resented him before, now truly hated him, but they were powerless. They were trapped in his financial web, forced to watch as the miser king, now a grief-stricken and isolated old man, bled their estates dry with an almost manic intensity. His court became a place of profound gloom. The king, dressed in black, rarely appeared in public. His days were spent in his private chambers, poring over his account books. His only trusted companions, the numbers on the page. He frantically sought a new wife, not for love, but for a new alliance and more heirs, proposing to various European princesses in a series of humiliatingly unsuccessful negotiations. He had achieved everything he had set out to do. He had survived. He had crushed his enemies. He had built a dynasty that would last for a century, but the cost was absolute. He died in 1509, a fabulously wealthy, powerful, and utterly miserable man, feared by all, but loved by none. He had secured the throne for the Tudors, but had filled its coffers with the poison of his own fear and suspicion of poison he was about to bequeathed to his far more dangerous son. In April 1509, the reign of the Winter King finally came to an end. Henry VII died, secretive and fearful to the very last. His throne passed to his 18-year-old son, a handsome, charismatic, and energetic young man who seemed to be everything his father was not. The nation rejoiced. The dark winter was over, and a glorious spring had arrived. This new king was Henry VIII. His first official act was a stroke of political genius to signal a clean break from his father's grim regime. He ordered the arrest of the two most despised men in all of England. His father's chief financial enforcers, Edmund Dudley and Richard Empson. The hated architects of the financial terror were charged with treason, and in a move that earned the new king widespread adulation, they were publicly executed. The people celebrated their young king as a liberator, a true hero who had freed them from the clutches of the miser king's extortionists. But this was the great deception of the Tudor succession. Henry VIII may have executed his father's henchmen, but he carefully preserved the machinery of terror they had built. The vast fortune his father had hoarded was now his to spend on wars and palaces. But his most valuable inheritance was not the gold in the treasury. It was the system of absolute power his father had perfected. The network of spies the council learned in the law, the use of bonds and recognisances to keep the nobility in a state of perpetual fear. Henry VIII inherited it all. He inherited a kingdom where the aristocracy had already been tamed, where the legal system could be bent to the monarch's will, and where the levers of a police state were already in place, waiting for a new master. His father, the Winter King, had been a gangster of governance, using fear and finance with the quiet precision of a stiletto in the dark. He ruled through paranoia and paperwork. The son would take that same power and wield it like a battle axe. Henry VIII added his own monstrous ego, his explosive rage, and his theological zeal to the cold, efficient tyranny he had inherited. The father had created the tools of oppression. The son would make them sing. And so, the Tudor catastrophe was born not in the fiery passions of Henry VIII, but in the cold, calculating paranoia of his father. Henry VII was the man who laid the foundation. He was the Winter King who froze the ground, killed the roots of opposition, and created the grim, hard landscape upon which the bloody history of his children would be written. He had clawed his way to a stolen throne, and in his desperate quest to keep it, he had forged the very chains that his son would use to enslave a kingdom. The Winter King forged the tools of tyranny. His son perfected their use. If you want to continue exploring the dark causes and terrifying effects of history, subscribe to the Black Chronicle and activate notifications. We have a question for you. Who was the greater tyrant, the father who built the cage, or the son who filled it with bodies? Let us know your verdict in the comments below.